Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are located. And welcome to today's session on the FIGI guidance on regulating e-KYC. Before starting today, I just would like to remind you a little bit about what is FIGI and what does it entail for those of you that are not so familiar with it. So FIGI is a partnership between the World Bank, the CPMI of the BIS, and ITU, the International Communications Union. And it's a program that is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It runs over three specific areas or topics globally, which are mainly digital ID, cybersecurity, and electronic payments acceptance. It also has implementation programs in 3 countries, which are Mexico, Egypt, and China. And this session is focused on the work that has been done by the Digital ID Working Group on digital ID and the implementation of such policy considerations. We're going to focus on the policy consideration 1, which relates to the regulatory aspects. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the distinguished panelists that we have with us today, which includes Shanna Krishnan. Shanna is a policy analyst at the Secretariat of the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. With Shanna, we have worked together in the development of the digital ID guidance note issued by the FATF in 2020. And it's also joined by Masood Rana. Masood is Joint Director at the Bangladesh Financial Intelligence Unit with the Bank of Bangladesh, and has also participated in this FIGI ID working group with extensive knowledge in the implementation of policies related to e-KYC. Furthermore, we have with us today the pleasure of having Mohamed Al-Duwaik. He's the head of digital financial services and innovations with the Central Bank of Jordan. Has been with the Central Bank of Jordan for 11 years plus, and focusing on fintech aspects and payment systems and domestic banking operations in the Financial Inclusion Department of the Central Bank of Jordan. Welcome all of you, and we hope that we have a fruitful discussion today. In terms of the housekeeping for all the audience connected today, we are planning to have a session combined between some presentations and some explanation with no presentation or slides behind it, just to put it out there. And each of the panelists will have 20 minutes each to discuss or present their different approaches or their different experiences in their respective countries. And then it would be followed by a session with questions and answers. If the audience wants to pose a question, I would ask them to go to the question and answer button by clicking that one, and include that question in the and write that question in that section. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now to give you a bit of background on this topic, and we can start the discussion. So the FIGI toolkit looked very closely at the issues that relate to the e-KYC, which is one of the aspects that has been in our minds for some time as an enabler of moving forward the financial inclusion goals, and in particular accessing to or introducing accessing to accounts, and not only having accounts open, but the usage of such accounts. Now, the digital ID, or the ID and electronic verification of such ID, has become quite important aspect to overcome the challenges for opening accounts. And the legal and regulatory framework supporting that usage and access to digital ID to verify the identities of individuals and legal entities has also become a critical aspect of that. In that term, we want to explore in this session how the regulatory framework supporting e-KYC initiatives has been framed or shaped in different countries, in different jurisdictions, and how the FATF recommendations, which set the stage for all these regulatory framework, has also moved along and understand and balance the needs for integrity together with the needs of inclusion. So within the policy consideration one of the toolkit, we set up some guidance on how this regulatory framework could be set up. This doesn't mean that it has to be like that, but it gives a flavor of aspects that have to be taken in consideration when countries put forward any KYC regulation. So it includes the dialogue between the different agencies and actors, and this, as we have seen, many countries developing siloed IDs just for specific groups or just for specific participants or sectors, and the need to move into more interoperable systems and connections with the national ID frameworks. The clear guidelines on regulations allowing appropriate risk-based use of digital ID systems. Not all ID systems could be valid for the specific functions in the financial sector, or could be allowed to be in compliance with the AML and CFT regulations. Then assess if the existing legal and regulatory framework allowed and convey for the usage of digital ID and e-verification of customers' identity. Even if a digital identity is available or in an electronic format, it's not always the case that financial service providers are allowed to access these for verification purposes. In terms of the Cdd requirements, it might also look into the topic of the harmonization between different financial service providers and the rules that apply to each of them regarding Cdd requirements. The technical standards on the usage of digital IDs, and supporting the usage of e-KYC solutions. And this involves also guidelines on both face-to-face, but also on non-face-to-face account opening or remote account opening, which is also something that we have seen increasingly important during this last year under COVID. And this brings us also for account opening to the topic of the e-signatures and the role that they play in different jurisdictions, and how the e-signature framework links to the digital ID. So finally, looking at how to mitigate those exclusion risks for not having a digital ID system in the country. So these are the aspects that we have seen, and we'll see how these have been shaped, or some of these aspects have been shaped in the different countries. I would leave the floor now to Shanna to explain to us the FATF recommendations and how this has been introduced into the digital ID guidance note. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Fredes, and thanks to the World Bank, the CPMI, the ITU for hosting this event and inviting us to speak. It's a real pleasure. I'm just going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully this will work. Great, so you should be able to see my screen at the moment. And just to give you a little bit of background, just minimize this. The Financial Action Task Force is the global standard setter for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. I work at the Secretariat of the FATF. And there are over 200 countries that have committed to implementing the FATF standards, and they've also committed to undergoing the evaluations that happen under our methodology. And I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking to you a little bit about our requirements, about diligence checks on customers, basically so they're not laundering money or financing terrorism through the financial services that are provided. And I'll also talk a little bit about how these requirements can be implemented in the modern context through digital ID. But before I say all of that, I guess important just to note for the FATF, financial inclusion and anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing are really complementary objectives. We see financial exclusion as a money laundering risk because it means that financing activities are moving into less transparent and unregulated channels, which makes it more difficult to combat money laundering. So this is a really important discussion that we're having today. So let's get into it. In terms of what is customer due diligence, CDD, in the FATF context, This is really defined in Recommendation 10 of the FATF standards. And it's just important to quickly note that the term that the FATF uses is CDD, customer due diligence. And this is a little bit different to the term KYC, which I think is a little bit more of a industry term. But CDD, I think, is a more comprehensive concept than just KYC, and I'll explain why. The slide includes the 4 key components of customer due diligence, and I'll focus on the first aspect, which I think is essentially what KYC is also referring to. So the first aspect is identifying a customer and then verifying that identity using reliable and independent source documentation, data, or information. It's important just to note that the FATF doesn't establish any specific requirements regarding the identification data that needs to be collected, or how exactly the private sector or countries should be required to verify that identity. And it's also important to say sometimes countries and financial institutions are taking a fairly conservative view of what constitutes appropriate identity elements or identifiers, as well as what is really required to verify identity documentation. And usually it's based on documents that most members of the community might have, including government issued ID or passports. But as we're having this discussion, many people don't have access to some of those common ID documents. And so the latest digital ID guidance, but also the FATF's financial inclusion guidance, really advocates for a broad interpretation. And that's something that the FATF standards don't prohibit, so that there's enough flexibility in the system to facilitate access to the regulated financial services. So that's the first component of CDD. Then there are other components that I'll just quickly touch on. The second is identifying the beneficial owner and taking reasonable measures to verify the identity of the beneficial owner. For legal persons and arrangements, this can include ownership and control structure of the customer. But when we're talking about financial inclusion, in most cases, the beneficial owner is the person, it's the customer opening the account. The third aspect is understanding the purpose and the intended nature of the business relationship, the reason why the account is being opened and for what reason it's going to be used. And the fourth is an important aspect. It's about conducting ongoing due diligence. It's continuing to monitor the account and scrutinize transactions to ensure that they are conducted in a way that's consistent with the institution's knowledge of the customer and their activities. And the important thing is it's not a static exercise. It's an ongoing and a dynamic exercise. So moving then to a risk-based approach, this is really at the heart of the FATF recommendations. It's set out in Recommendation 1, which shows the priority that we put on this. Here, both countries, the public sector, as well as the private sector, are required to identify, assess, and understand their risks, and then apply AML-CFT measures in a way that responds to those risks. And that really means for higher risks, we ask that enhanced measures should be applied, and for lower risks, that also means that simplified measures should apply. And the key thing to kind of remember here is that a one-size-fits-all approach is just not acceptable under the FATF standards and what we require. So I've set out here some of the application of this in relation to CDD, and in particular, in terms of CDD, the risk-based approach impacts the intensity and the extent to which customer and transaction information is required, and the mechanisms we use to ensure these standards are met. And really, the CDD measures need to vary depending on the risk level. That's the key message. The FATF gives examples of circumstances where money laundering or terrorist financing might be considered as potentially lower. There are a few examples in the standards themselves in the interpretive note to recommendation 10. And then there are other examples in the financial inclusion guidance I referred to. The important thing here to note is that the standards themselves include this dot point here about financial products or services that provide appropriately defined limited services to certain types of customers so as to increase access for financial inclusion. So financial inclusion products are specifically kind of catered for in the FATF standards as an area of potential lower risk. So just moving to some of the examples of simplified due diligence, I just thought, I won't go through all of them, but I thought this might be kind of helpful for the participants to see. Some of these examples are in the standards themselves, but the FATF's financial inclusion guidance, again, walks through these with some more kind of country examples. The most common, I guess, simplified measure is to ask for less information or to ask for it less frequently from the prospective customer. The number of identifiers might be lower, the requirements to verify the information might be lower, and in terms of ongoing due diligence, you might come back to the customer less frequently. Another important measure is to allow for a broad range of acceptable identification means. I've already mentioned it, and I probably mentioned it a few times again, but that's again a simplified CDD measure. Another thing that we use, it can refer to in the standards, is delayed verification. So it might be that more checks are only done if the activity on the account reaches a certain risk-based threshold. So people who are using the accounts below that threshold face less requirements. So that could be, for example, a monetary threshold or a frequency threshold. We talked about also understanding the business relationship. That's one of the elements of CDD. Some of this can be inferred by the type of the account offered or how it's used by the customer over time. Some countries also talked about a tiered CDD approach, and that's basically predefining different categories of accounts with different functionalities and also defining the associated CDD requirements. And it basically allows the private sector to offer basic accounts, avoiding some of the activities that might be considered more risky from a money laundering terrorist financing perspective, but also being able to open these accounts with the confidence that they have to do less CDD. An interesting part, and I'll mention it again, is also progressive CDD. This is this concept of as a customer engages with an entity over a period of time, you get a better idea of that customer and their identity. And so it's really to use the ongoing activities and transactions to build a better picture of the customer themselves. The last 2 points here, just important to mention that simplified CDD measures need to be tailored to the risks and that there are different levers in those requirements. So one example we use frequently is that you might use quite simplified measures for identification and verification. There might not be that much information required, but at the stage of ongoing monitoring, you continue to review the account and monitor it so that you're alerted if the customer is using it in an unusual way, considering what the intended purpose is. And that helps to balance and mitigate some of the potential risks while still allowing access. The other point to make, it's fairly obvious one, in the point of onboarding or in the course of the relationship, if there are suspicions that money laundering and terrorist financing take place, then we also require that enhanced measures are applied at that stage. So this brings me to the digital ID guidance, and the FATF released this guidance in March 2020. We worked with governments, financial institutions, and other financial service providers, as well as digital ID experts to come up with this document. And the really important point is, the FATF is technology neutral. We don't tell countries or the private sector which types of technology to use, but we don't want to be silent about the possibilities and the benefits that technology can bring to combating money laundering and terrorist financing. And this guidance is really an important piece of that work that the FATF is doing to encourage the use of technology. It's really designed here to provide some more comfort about digital ID and how it can be used for CDD, because we did see some reluctance in some corners in relation to this. And what we tried to do is to provide a framework for assessing what it means for a digital ID to be reliable or independent in terms of the FATF standards. Essentially, what makes digital ID trustworthy for identifying and verifying a customer. And this slide sets out the key messages from the guidance. It's quite a long guidance, so there are some explanatory materials on our website, but the key message is that we need to apply a risk-based approach in relation to digital ID. And we highlight the benefits of trustworthy digital ID in terms of reducing costs, increasing convenience to the consumer, but also to the private sector, whilst not compromising on security. And that's really the important point. And considering that cost might be an inhibitor to financial inclusion in some cases, we think this is an important point to potentially reducing cost barriers for consumers. Importantly, we also said that non-face-to-face identification should not immediately be considered at high risk compared to face-to-face onboarding. And this is something that's obviously developed over time. Initially and in the past, non-face-to-face identification may have been considered higher risk because some of these solutions in relation to remote identification were just not available. And so the point that the guidance makes is that if there's trustworthy digital ID available, well, actually, this can be a situation of standard risk or even lower risk, considering that some of the protections put in place by some of these solutions. We highlight in the next point that there is a lot of flexibility in the FATF standards, and that flexibility needs to be explored and utilized for the best anti-money laundering outcomes and the best financial inclusion outcomes as well. And one of the key recommendations from this guidance is really the need to work with a broad range of stakeholders, including the private sector, including technology providers. What we kind of experienced in doing this project is that many of these stakeholders speak different languages in terms of the standards and requirements, and it's really important to bring people together so we can move forward together on some of these issues. Fred, interrupt me if I'm taking too long, but I'll keep going for the moment because I can't see the time on my computer. So here I've set out the flowchart in the digital ID guidance. This is really the decision process we set out, or that we suggest, to determine if a digital ID is trustworthy. And here I'm going to refer to banks, but it applies to the whole range of service providers captured under the standards. And this decision process basically covers two main issues. The first issue is, do you know the technical reliability of the digital ID proposed? And this is covered in question 1 and question 2. And then the second issue is, given the level of technical reliability, will the digital ID address the money laundering, terrorist financing risks faced, represented by the customer or the product? And that's covered in question 3. So if I just take you quickly through this flow chart, I know it looks complicated, but it's really just a way of processing, I guess, some of these issues. So question 1 basically asks if the digital ID system is already authorized by the government for use in CDD, in which case it's pretty simple. In a lot of circumstances, and increasingly, we see that governments are developing EIDs, and this may specifically state, they might specifically state that banks can use this EID for customer due diligence. And in this case, we consider that the government has assessed digital ID, that it's technically reliable and that it's appropriate, considering the money laundering, terrorist financing risks, and therefore it can be used by the private sector. If the government, though, is silent on this issue about whether the the digital ID can be used for customer due diligence, we move to question 2, which asks if there are other means in the jurisdiction to assess the technical reliability of the digital ID. If not, the bank needs to undertake its own assessment of the technical reliability. This then brings us to question 3. And at this stage, we should know what the technical reliability of the digital ID is based on assurance standards, etc. But we don't necessarily know how appropriate it is for use in CDD. And here we ask banks to assess the money laundering terrorist financing risks and think about whether the digital ID is appropriate. If the answer is yes, then it can be used. If not, then it can't be used without being supplemented with further information. And the point of this, this whole process is basically to say that there couldn't be digital IDs of different levels of reliability that can be used in a range of circumstances, depending on the money laundering terrorist financing risks. The digital ID guidance also covers special considerations for financial inclusion. I think I've probably mentioned some of them already, but the first is about flexible identity requirements and highlighting that there are a broader range of identifiers potentially thanks to digital means. And this includes, but obviously is not limited to, biometrics, for example. We also talk about using basic digital IDs to give people access to basic accounts, and then using digital means to have measures in place to make sure that the accounts are being used as intended, something I already touched upon. And then the other last point as well is, the use of digital ID may open the door for people to build their identity over the course of a relationship with a bank or other provider. It's what I refer to as progressive identity. Because we can capture these interactions in a more consistent way, we might be able to better develop people's identity over time and then give them access to more account functionalities as we have more confidence that we know who we're dealing with. So that's a quick snapshot of the digital ID guidance and the CDD measures. I've included here the guidances, but also links to the guidances if you need more information. I'll turn over to you again, Fredes.
Thank you very much, Shana, for this comprehensive view of the recommendations and the explanation, because that's also important. Sometimes we read the documents and it's difficult to grasp the initial intention of the drafters. So thank you so much. I know there are some questions already aligned for you. We'll leave them for the end of the session, but just be prepared to respond some of them. And I'll give the floor now to Masood. Please, Masood, go ahead and walk us through the experience of Bangladesh with the moving on to e-KYC regulation.
Thanks, friends. And first of all, I would like to sincere thanks to all hosts for inviting me to speak here, my distinguished moderator, panelist, and participant. Very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, where you are located. Though I have a very big presentation, but I'll be very brief, and I will try to cover the snapshot of my presentation here. For the smooth internet, I think I just turn off my video so that you can hear my voice clearly and loudly. So next slide, please. The objective of this session is to introduce you about ID infrastructure in Bangladesh, as well as the e-KYC regime. Next slide, please. As you know, Bangladesh is moving towards achieving the dream announced by our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to build digital Bangladesh. There are several targets we actually fulfill by implementing digital KYC. We have a sustainable development goal, and where several targets are to introduce and ensure financial services to all by 2030, as well as our Prime Minister's Vision 2021 also covers and reaffirm her firm commitment to provide financial service at the doorstep of the citizen in an easy, faster, and low-cost manner. As well as we have a target within the AML CFT national strategy as set by Bangladesh government. Next slide, please. As said earlier, the introduction of e-KYC satisfies several goals of UN SDG, and it targets also Vision 2021. So it is expected that efficient implementation of electronic KYC or digital KYC will ensure national level well-being by ensuring the greater financial inclusion, lowering the cost of financial institutions, promoting fintech companies and innovations, establish good governance at every step. KYC regulation also urges for financial inclusion and fintech company as well to onboard their client digitally. Next slide, please. So before launching the e-KYC regulation or digital KYC regulation, a multi-agency working group actually ran a pilot with assistance of World Bank in 42 districts, 50 plus location. We ran a pilot project, and in this, the outcome of this pilot project, we see that our ID infrastructure is sufficient enough to provide the digital verification system, as well as it can significantly save time and cost of financial institution, and as well as it also helps the business growth of financial institutions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here, just one before. Yeah, there is a national identity infrastructure in Bangladesh. This infrastructure actually held by our Electoral Commission, and with the, by using the national ID, the Election Commission can verify the ID via SDK system. Next slide, please. And recently, government has introduced another verification platform based on the national ID database, which is called Porichoy. Porichoy means Porichoy is actually Bengali word. In English, its meaning is introduction or introduce someone. So this platform is basically API based, and the NID database actually used for only open for the financial institutions and government agencies. But this Porichoy is open for all government agencies, bank, financial institutions, fintech companies. So and this Porichoy is also API based. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So if you look at the digital KYC guideline, the component of digital KYC covers several things. One of them is client onboarding, then preserving the client profile in a digital manner, client risk, AML CFT risk grading in a digital manner, as well as automation of all sort of AML CFT utilities like sanctions check-in, PEPs checking, and so on. Next slide, please. So in the regulation, we actually follow the risk-based approach, and we have provided guidance to follow simplified digital KYC and regular digital KYC. From the regular digital KYC, if the customer is higher risk, then could be escalated into the high risk scenario. Next slide, please. So we cover, we actually apply the threshold approach. Where the threshold is lower, we follow the simplified measures. Where the threshold is higher, we follow the regular measures, and where necessary, enhanced measure. So we divided the different segments and put a threshold for each segment. Especially the digital financial services, the MFS, PSP, PSO, and fintech companies are put into the low risk scenario, and other financial products like banking products, securities product below the threshold, the simplified measures could be applied, and the threshold is near about $10,000. And the higher threshold, if someone transact with the higher threshold, he or she will fall in the regular CDD measures. Next slide, please. These are the so how this digital onboarding works. So there are few steps, step-by-step process by where a customer can, by using this step, customer can onboard customer, digital data is provided, and customers utility, AML CFT utility has been changed. So we actually follow two basic approach, biometric approach. One is fingerprint, another is face matching approach. So you can see the face fingerprint steps, how a client can onboard digitally by using the his or her fingerprint. Next slide, please. This is the if anyone any customer using the face matching approach. This is basically for the non-face-to-face customer. So face matching technology we use for the non-face-to-face to customer onboarding process. These are the process. Next slide, please. Next, please. And we suggest two sort of onboarding mechanism. One is self-check-in mechanism, another is assisted check-in mechanism. Self-check-in, a customer can open account sitting his or her home office anywhere without going in or visiting to the financial institution. And assisted check-in, a agent or a official of financial institution assist someone to get on board into the financial institutions or opening the account. Next slide, please. At the back end, we set some parameters. So the basic matching parameters, when system actually go green for the onboarding. So we put some parameters like applicant's name, date of face matching, father's name, mother's name 80%, and NID number and date of birth 100% should be 100% match, and this should be preserved as in a uneditable mode. And next slide, please. And there are some other things within the regulation. For example, we encourage for the two-factor and multi-factor authentication, PIN and other measures, e-signatures, and we prefer to use our financial system locally hosted server. We emphasize on the data protection and privacy and data transmission to the third party as well. And we put some compliance on the third party and the financial institution and the implementation mechanism. Next slide, please. Here are the risk grading template for it's a 360-degree risk grading process. There are some question in every criteria, and there are some score against that question. So end result is if it is below 15, the risk type will be regular, and if it is 15 or higher, it would be higher. Next slide, please. And we also provide the sample digital profile, how they should keep the record for further use. This is actually the sample digital profile. Next slide, please. And as you know, we have introduced e-KYC or digital KYC regulation in January 2020, and we set a target to implement December 2021, as said by timeline set by the People's Republic of Bangladesh. But however, we can actually can't go by the deadline, as you know, due to pandemics. So next slide, please. Let's have some implementation status. So far, all the mobile financial institution or digital financial institutions, they have implemented e-KYC. So far, 10 banks have already introduced digital KYC. 2 non-bank financial institutions, 2 insurance companies, and 1 capital market intermediaries are already in live and using digital KYC, and the rest financial institution actually almost they reach their target 80–90%. Next slide, please. And the account opened so far, almost 38 million account opened by using digital KYC. And for the smooth implementation, we are on the way to launch a project on digital KYC, so that the aim of this project is to assist the financial institution to complete or implement their project smoothly and efficiently with the assistance of IFC. Next slide, please. So our next target is actually to implement, because our regulation is only for the natural person, but we are looking forward to implement digital KYC regime for the legal entity as well. And we are also looking forward to build a KYC registry in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. I think I am on time. Thank you for your patience hearing. If you have any further question, I'm happy to answer you later, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Masood. And I'm sure that there are already questions also in the chat for you. So we'll take them at the end of the session after Mohammed's intervention. And I will also have additional questions for you regarding your implementation process. So let's give the floor now to Mohammed. Please go ahead. And I know there is no presentation on your side, but please explain to us the journey that Jordan and the Central Bank of Jordan came with in terms of establishing and developing e-KYC regulations, and what has been the roles of the different stakeholders. Thank you so much, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, hello everyone, wherever you are located. First of all, let me thank our host, the World Bank and CFT, for my invitation. And as the different aspects from different countries, that how they look into the concept of digital identity and e-KYC modules, I will take it not in the perspective of Central Bank of Jordan alone, but as the whole kingdom, and how as a government they are looking into the concept. Let's start with that the government of Jordan has started to build a unified digital identity solution that will provide all citizens with a reliable and verified ID that can be used in different services, not only in the financial sector. That is going to be a very solid and strong backbone for the Central Bank of Jordan to build on. That is for the financial institutions and how they are looking for the documents that we use for the KYC in the first place. As we all know that we can rely in both documents, that is a government issued documents or non-government issued documents for the, as Sasha said, in the CDD, but at the first level of verification, that if it's a government verified and proved identity, it's going to be stronger and more reliable for financial institutions. In that approach, the government of Jordan has finished building the unified digital identity platform for the citizen, for the individuals. And then the second phase, we hopefully now starting for finalizing it for the corporates. Into that, Central Bank of Jordan also have start building the PKI infrastructure using the digital signature for the financial institution and their clients into that aspect. Combining both approaches, it's going to be a very good step in the term of e-KYC implementation. But as we cannot stop the wheel of the improvement in the financial sector, we have multi-initiatives in the financial sector aside of the regulations of the central bank have been already started from the banking sectors and also from the PSPs, mobile wallet service providers. As we all went through in the COVID-19 the last year, hopefully that we pass it this year, even if the regulations were not there yet or issued by central banks or authorities, financial institutions has to take the lead and to see how they can move forward in their services to simplify it and to provide it in an efficient and effective way. So here in Jordan, we have different approaches have been taken, relying onto reliable parties, Jordanian companies, or even worldwide ones to build the service. Also, as a regulator, Central Bank of Jordan have issued some instructions regarding simplifying the KYC, but maybe it was not detailed as we were concentrating on the idea that each financial institution, regarding the difference between them, need to understand their own products and their own clients. So we were emphasizing on the approach, the risk-based approach for all the financial institutions. We have issued something for the basic bank account, relying about the digital onboarding, specifically for basic bank accounts and basic wallets because of the COVID-19, and there were an insist of the government for special aids to be distributed in, and there were a specific need. But we were all the time saying that the understanding on the FATF recommendations and the understanding of how to implement the risk-based approach regarding the KYC is the most important milestone to get into the full implementation of, let's say, the full digital services. And it's not just about the KYC itself, as there is a difference even between the first time KYC and all other practices in that regard. And so in Jordan, also, I have to mention that we have an initiative started by the executive arm of Central Bank of Jordan, which is JOPAC, the Jordanian company for payment and clearing. They have started to build a unified platform for e-KYC, relying on the digital identity that will be built by the government. In that regard, they were targeting the whole financial institution, not just the banks, also the FSPs, taking into consideration the differences between the requirements that is related to the products and the clients themselves and the behavior affecting that market. That initiatives, we hopefully we will see the light within 2021, and after having a wide look from the regulator perspective, from central bank perspective, when he's taking a look over all the initiatives that already have been started or being developed during this year, Central Bank of Jordan is drafting digital onboarding requirements and instructions for the financial institutions, but he will wait till we have a wider look, also have a wider look for other experiences, emphasizing and again saying that the regulator is there to support, to give the whole view of understanding of the compliance of the regulations, but it's up to the financial institutions to differentiate between the needs that and the things he need to implement, and to ask to make sure that he's understanding and he's knowing his client and have the suitable documentation, suitable questions and answers to make him relieve that he's in mitigating the risks that he's facing, to give the products in a suitable way for the end users, meeting all the requirements and the recommendation in that regard.
Thank you, Mohammed. I guess you have finished your explanation of the situation in Jordan, or we lost you?
I do you hear me?
We hear you now.
Yeah, sorry. And that is a wide range of how it's moving forward in the concept of digital identity and KYC in Jordan, as a concentration of the concept of e-KYC is not taking alone to be just implemented as a concept. We are trying to see how it's being effective. And also we have something which is, let's say, we have a new law for AML CFT that being just confirmed 2 or 3 days ago from the parliament. So we have to take in a wide range of perspective. Everything is affecting the implementation of regulations. So again, as a regulator of financial institutions, we are not in a rush to issue more instructions or detailed instructions for the market. We are giving the space for the market to start implementing electronic services, even regarding the e-KYC by themselves, and to come back for the regulator for any additional guidance and support if needed. This is the whole picture from Jordan and how we see it. If any questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. This was very illustrative, and to hear the position of the Central Bank of Jordan in terms of allowing the financial service providers to come up with solutions and take some risks there, and then come to the Central Bank for additional guidance. I want to pose some questions for each of you. For Shanna, I will start with you, and I would like to know, based on all the work that the FATF has done so far on the recommendations, on explaining the recommendations with the interpretative notes, with additional guidance on financial inclusion, and then with the guidance on digital ID, how do you envision the countries to adopt this guidance and move on to e-KYC solutions? Because what we hear is that there is some kind of cautious from some institutions at national level in terms of adopting e-KYC solutions that might not meet the recommendations from FATF. So if you could guide us there.
Sure. Thanks, Fredes, and it was really interesting presentations by the other panelists as well. Good to hear them. So this is a very topical issue because the FATF is just starting a project, or it's in the middle of a project on understanding some of the unintended consequences that might result from the standards or implementation of them. And one of these issues is specifically what you mentioned, that countries aren't really using the full extent of the flexibility in the standards to include like simplified due diligence or exemptions, etc. And there are a number of options, I guess, for us to continue to enhance that. That's something that's under consideration by the FATF. One of the important things for us is to continue to speak to jurisdictions in events like this, but also to bring up these issues through the mutual evaluation process to ensure that the issues in relation to financial exclusion are addressed through the mutual evaluation process. I think that's an important tool that we have. And eventually it might be that there is enough experience here, and I definitely see that the experience has definitely increased, I would say, since our last financial inclusion guidance. So there might be an opportunity for us to provide kind of more practical, more tangible advice to give countries, more confidence in relation to that. But as I said, it's something we're continuing to look at in the FATF.
Thank you, Shanna. I'll turn now to Masood. Masood, I would be interested in knowing how Bank of Bangladesh has balanced the financial inclusion objectives together with the integrity objectives when you put forward your e-KYC strategy and the regulations around them. If you could elaborate a little bit on this, that would be great.
Thanks, Fredes. Actually, you point out the very critical issues like balancing financial inclusion and financial integrity. And every country actually doing balancing via risk-based approach. So if you ask me, the one word answer, it's risk-based approach. And we are actually following the risk-based approach. And in the presentation, perhaps you see that we also adopted risk-based approach in digital KYC regulation as well. And we have also provided different sort of flexibility for promoting financial inclusion as well. For example, I can say about the Rohingya issues. Perhaps you all know about the Rohingya influx in Bangladesh. And now actually we allow little flexibility for them. They can onboard selective financial actually MFS service provider, but by using their UNHCR registration card. This is one sort of flexibility. And within our regulation, even we have flexibility, a person who actually don't have the ID or digital ID. So he or she can obtain a certificate from the public servant or the public representative and can open account, especially the low risk account. So there are several flexibilities there. We have also suggested lower KYC for the people who are actually behind the society. So there is a lot of flexibility in Bangladesh, so that no one leave behind just in case of without having digital ID. So these are actually the flexibility. We are balancing the financial integrity with the financial inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Masuda. I would guess that for these groups of population with lower KYC, it's also associated with limited products and services. Is that correct?
Yep.
Now moving on to Mohammed, the situation in Jordan. I would be interested in learning about the role of these relying parties in and the evolution of some financial institutions developing their own systems, and how this has been adopted in the context of Jordan, like specific solutions that have been developed by financial service providers. And how do you see all these different solutions come together in this flexible ecosystem that the Central Bank of Jordan is encouraging?
Actually, we see it as a good approach, that different perspective and different implementation containing the minimum requirements is a good way to understand the needs of different clients and to implement different products in the market. Different perspective from outside of Jordan, helping the local companies is good, but also to give the trust for internal initiatives to build their own perspective of how they see the market, not just copying other implementations, is a good approach that is very supported from the Central Bank of Jordan perspective. We understand that we may face some interoperability issues if we start to connect different approaches and different implementation. This is why we just asked financial institutions to come to Central Bank of Jordan before launching any product, to get agreed with the minimum requirements that will fit all, and make them compete in additional features within the same structure. But you will be shocked if you see that even its different implementation, the base is always the same. We are all building in the same aspects and the same requirements and the same understanding of money anti-laundering and anti-terrorism recommendations that we need all to understand. And even if we are moving from KYC to e-KYC, it is a KYC at the end of the day. And if you are still understanding and have the concept of the risk-based approach in different aspects, not in AML CFT only, then the base is there. And you can rely on your institution and give them the trust to give you different aspects and help you also as a regulator to be as flexible as the market need, and in the same time to still concrete for the compliance of the financial institution.
Just a follow-up question here, Mohammed. So just for the understanding of the audience, so if I have an account with Bank A and they conduct my e-KYC with that bank, and I go to Bank B to open another type of account of service, do I need to go through two different processes of KYC, or is some kind of collaborative coordination between the different institutions?
As I mentioned before, in the initiative of JOPAC, the executive arm of the central bank, it's going to be the same process that you will rely on if we are talking about the same institutions, let's say the same field banks or PSPs together, exchange houses together, you will take the same requirements relying on the KYC that it's already implemented in the other institution. And it's going to be the same journey because it's already there, relying on a governmental verified data already in the first time.
Thank you so much for that clarification on the JOPAC initiative. So I'll turn back to one of the questions that has been posed here by the audience. And sorry about that. One of the questions that it's already in the audience is in the cost of limiting the fighting ML and TF risks appears to have fallen disproportionately on developing countries, especially, and the question comes from the Caribbean countries. The stringent approach on CDD and KYC has led to some de-risking. So what can be done from FATF to mitigate these unintended consequences, such as the risking and the rise in financial exclusion? I guess this question is directed to Shanna.
Thanks, Fredez. Yeah, I provided an answer in writing, but I'll speak to it a little bit as well. So I thank you for the question. It's a really important issue, one that the FATF has been focusing on for quite some years now. And I guess the most important point that we continue to make to countries and to the private sector is that from the FATF perspective, de-risking is just unacceptable. It's shifting the risk to another place, and wholesale letting go of customers or categories of customers is just not in line with the risk-based approach or what we want to achieve from an AML CFT system. So that's an important point I think we need regulators to hear, and that's part of trying to get regulators and supervisors to take the issue seriously and also set the right indications for the private sector in the countries providing the correspondent banking services. Another important point, I guess, to mention is, that it is a complex issue. We're doing further work to understand de-risking and all the kind of drivers for it. Obviously, we've seen in some circumstances, profitability of some of those relationships is a really important factor. But we are looking at this, and I mentioned the project to study unintended consequences, and de-risking is a big part of that. And we're going to look at what we can do to further this. I mentioned the role of the evaluations in the answer, and I think that is an important point because building up the supervisory capacity in the countries is an important way to give the private sector and other countries more confidence that your institutions are in fact taking anti-money laundering seriously. And so far as the evaluations help to put more focus on these issues and to improve supervision through the recommended actions, etc., I think that's a positive thing. But a slow process because evaluations only take place once in 10 years at the moment. Another thing I think that's been useful, it's not really something that the FATF can do, but what we've seen is that engagement between some of the jurisdictions that are providing correspondent banking relationships that have respondent banks and are experiencing de-risking is to see kind of innovative cooperation between those jurisdictions to better understand the risks and to give the private sector again more confidence about the relevant entities that are doing a good job of combating money laundering, for example, in the Caribbean. And the Pacific, I think, is a pretty good example of this. I know that they've done kind of a regional risk assessment, that there are other measures in place to improve correspondent banking relationships between Pacific Island countries and Australia and New Zealand, for example. So this is also another kind of, I think, useful way for governments to also be kind of more involved and active in addressing these issues.
Thank you, Shannon. There is a question also from the audience directed to Masood. Masood, this is in relation to the PEPs, and if you have a registration or a registered database of PEPs linked to your e-KYC tool or not in the case of Bangladesh. I think you're muted, Masood.
Thank you, Fritz. Actually, we don't have the National PEP Register, but in Bangladesh, we have issued a guidance for the financial sector, specifically on the politically exposed person, including the local PEPs. And in this guidance, the criteria for the local PEPs has already been set out. So anyone can identify who are the PEPs by using the inside of this guidance. However, generally our financial institutions actually use the vendor data automated tool to identify the politically exposed person.
Thank you so much for this response, Masood. Going to Mohammed in Jordan, what are have you found in your journey that there are specific products or services that are fostered that are offered to foster financial inclusion that are more challenging in terms of KYC than others?
Actually, if the most regulated sector is the banking sector. So if we get across the product that is offered by the banking sector, maybe as a requirement, it's going to be easy for other financial institutions to offer their products, let's say for the MFIs or the PSPs or other. Maybe for the cross-border remittances, especially the exchange houses case in Jordan, consider one of the most critical and risky products that is consuming the efforts of the regulators to take into consideration while they are prohibiting or approving approvals regarding the KYC in general. I don't know if Shana is okay.
I believe, Shana, there's a rebound question for you.
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. So, Mohammed, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's definitely one of the areas which is more complicated. The financial inclusion guidance talks about recommendation 14 and the fact that there is kind of a threshold in there of 1,000 euros USD, and that for that requirements in relation to the information that can be collected is kind of lower in those situations. But what we've seen is, and we continue to focus on this issue with MVTS, money value transfer services, and the potential de-risking or difficulties in relation to this. Again, there is that question of profitability, but there is also a question of resources and capability in terms of both the institutions themselves in being able to implement this. Often the MVTS agents or companies are fairly small, and they might be operating from a shop. They don't have the same resources as banks and others, as well as for the supervisors. In general, I would say, again, the regulation and supervision of this sector is not as strong or as risk-based in many of the evaluations. So there are lots of things I think we can kind of work on. There are several kind of ongoing tracks of work in the FATF. I should have mentioned it previously as well, but we're working with FREDES from the World Bank, but also some of the other standard setting bodies under this global project by the Financial Stability Board on improving cross-border payments. And digital ID is an important building block in part of that. But there's also questions about, how do we make sure that the requirements are more standardized across countries? Is that possible? How do we make sure that entities in another country know whether an MVTS is actually supervised and regulated? And would that give them more confidence to provide relevant services, etc.? So there is, I think, definitely more work to be done here. Yeah.
Shanna, it's good that you brought that project up, because I see a question from the audience regarding the recognition of foreign IDs, and this is also something that we are looking at on this enhancement of cross-border payments, and we're looking this from a building block called 8, which looks at how to enable the digital ID or the identification of individuals involved in cross-border payments. So this is still an ongoing work, but if you want to learn more about how this is evolving, please check on the FSP website or the CPMI. Both of them are involved in this project, and I'm sure that you'll see in the next months some additional information there. The work will be finalized by December 2022. And if you're interested also in participating or sharing with us the challenges that in your respective countries you're facing, more than willing that you reach out to either Shanna or myself, that we are involved in this work as we speak. So very grateful if you want to collaborate with us. And now I also wanted to ask Masood a little bit more about the experience on setting up a pilot in order to identify potential challenges or opportunities in developing a KYC solution. Can you elaborate a little bit about this pilot and the lessons learned from the pilot? What would you have done if you started over again? Would you change something? That I think would be useful for us to understand better.
Thank you. Thank you, Fredes. Perhaps you noticed that I have touched few issues during my presentation on a e-KYC pilot, which we roll out actually into 2019 with the assistance of World Bank as well. Within this pilot, actually, we have taken very little sample. It's together is around 20K. Just before launching the guidelines, actually, we are eager to see what would be the impact of this guideline. That's why we roll out this pilot in a pretty small manner. But the lessons from this pilot actually is really good. As I mentioned, our ID infrastructure is capable enough to provide the verification service for the AML safety regime, as well as in terms of time saving. The savings was tremendously lowering down from 2-3 days to only 4 or 5 minutes. And in terms of the cost, our finding is the cost reduced almost more than 10 times. And in terms of business growth, the findings of the e-KYC pilot was almost more than 20%. So now we are planning to go for a big study, that is impact study. So we have, as I mentioned, we have taken a project along with IFC and World Bank for a smooth implementation of e-KYC across the sector, where we will also do a impact study in a bigger manner, so that we can have a bigger picture over there. So just in a short In short, I can say our experience from the pilot that can divide into four. One is ID system is fair, robust enough. Second is time saves from 2 to 3 days to only 4 to 5 minutes, and 20% business growth. These are actually the outcomes of our e-KYC pilot. Thank you, Fredis.
Thank you, Masood. And yeah, just have a final question for both of you. I know that Mohammed has touched upon those on the cross-border payments, but if you could maybe summarize or highlight some of the challenges that you see faced by both citizens, non-citizens that are residents, and maybe citizens living abroad, in terms of conducting some kind of cross-border payments, and any challenges related to conducting KYC, but the different institutions. That would be also some interesting aspects if this has to be followed by some kind of regulatory approaches or some practices to smooth this identification. You want to go ahead,
Yeah.
Masood, and then we follow with Mohammed.
Okay, thank you. So far, as you know, Bangladesh is one of the top 10 remittance receiving country, and in terms of remittances, we have several CDD mechanism across the financial institution, because perhaps you know, nowadays our NGO are disbursing the MFIs are disbursing the remittance payments as well. So we have already been provided, already been imposed KYC verification services to them. Many NGOs and MFIs are now using the especially Porichoy platform, which is very convenient and API based, recently launched by Ministry of ICT of Bangladesh government. So we are promoting, because the financial institutions, they are actually habituated. However, the newly coming MFIs and NGOs, we are consulting with them, we are promoting with them with the KYC regulation, because we have several separate circular for the NGOs and MFIs as well. So in case of remittance, we are advising them to conduct proper CDD as required. This is why I think the challenge is only building the awareness. However, we have the main problem of remittance. We have actually the hundi or hawala, which is actually not come to, through the formal channel. So we are actually targeting and using our more resources and focusing more on that, how we can reduce the hundi. We have taken several steps, and we have introduced several mechanisms so that it can come back to the formal channel. So these are the actually two things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mohammed, do you have any thoughts to share with us on how can we identify these challenges and maybe tackle them?
Actually, maybe one of the challenges that is being faced by the end users, the understanding of different phases that the new financial institutions are playing. So remittance institution is now different than the source of fund who is funding this transaction. Let's say that as a mobile wallet providers who is not in Jordan allowed to do the cross-border, they have to deal with the remittance institutions. So the problem and the point of view of the client, that they are not understanding how is they are being affected by the requirements of the KYC or the CDD by the financial institutions, and the one who is facing him as a source of fund. So different levels of institutions, different ways of implementing cross-border remittance, or let's say the hawala, as Masoud says, it's going to be the easier way. So I will go beyond all the regulations and to see the easiest way that no one is asking me, taking into consideration that it's for him, for protecting him or protecting the whole country. But this is the main challenge, to make the client or the end user, the citizens, understand what is being asked by the regulators and the different entities they are dealing with. Each time you are improving the journey, taking into consideration now we have the concept of the third parties and open banking concept, that you may be allowed to generate the transfer from a third party application that is not the source of fund application, and the implications of the required data that may be applies in that scenario, and how do the citizens will understand the differentiation between across all the financial institutions differences.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So I know there is a question from the audience that refers to how to verify foreign national IDs. And the question in the chat is directed to Shana. Shana, any response here?
Nothing absolute. I mean, I responded in writing to give, I guess, some ideas, but basically the digital ID guidance didn't cover this issue in particular. It doesn't cover cross-border issues. It really looked at the domestic context. And I've mentioned in there that, you know, we did in the course of doing the digital ID guidance, speak to lots of service providers who were telling us about different tools to be able to, you know, look at digital copies of passports and use, you know, different tools to verify that information, to make sure that it was an accurate document, etc. So there are, you know, obviously more tools, I think, available digitally than there might be even in a face-to-face kind of context. And the other thing to mention is we also had, in the context of refugees, the UNHCR was an active participant of the work we did on the guidance, and they have a digital ID for refugees that they are trying to roll out in more jurisdictions. So I think this could also be a very useful tool for those who might not necessarily have a passport, for example. But like I said, we don't have specific guidance on this. I think probably Masood and Mohammed maybe have more of a practical idea of how it actually works.
So if I go back to that question, we also see in some countries that despite being foreigners, you might have a residence card that it's also linked to the national ID system, and that could be verified. Now, this is also another challenge. If this could be verified, if this could be verified electronically or not, and what are the conditions for foreigners to access these resident cards, and what are the policies in the different financial service providers to accept these cards as a government-issued form of ID for opening account and transacting different financial services. This is what we are seeing. We are exploring what is the current situation in some countries as we speak now. But it would be great to have the responses from Mohammed and Masood if they have some thoughts on the respective jurisdictions. Thank you. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Can I proceed?
Go ahead, Masood, please.
Okay, thank you. Just I can share our experience. Perhaps the question was the foreign national ID card is verifiable or not. Ideally, generally, it is not verifiable. However, there are few fintech companies like Trulio, Passport. They actually building some database from different countries. So with these fintech companies, someone might verify the nationality or national ID of foreign national. That might be possible. In case of our country, as I mentioned about the Porichoy gateway, if any foreign institution enter into the service agreement with Porichoy, and if any national or citizen of Bangladesh opened account abroad, in abroad, then that particular foreign entities can verify Bangladeshi national identity from abroad. For example, the Skrill, perhaps you know the fintech company Skrill. So Skrill have entered into an agreement with our Porichoy platform, which is a ICT Ministry's platform. Now, any freelancer of Bangladesh open a digital wallet with this Skrill, Skrill can verify the Bangladeshi identity. So this sort of thing we are actually promoting, because you know a lot of Bangladeshi working outside of Bangladesh, and a lot of Bangladeshi bringing remittance through freelancing, but they are receiving this remittance through different sort of card, different sort of fintech companies. So we are promoting those fintech companies. Okay, you have to have onboard Bangladeshi citizen by verifying Bangladeshi national ID, because you can verify that using the Porichoy platform.
Thank you, Masood. I think that if you can briefly respond, Mohammed, on the situation in Jordan, because we have to close up. We are running a little bit late already. But
okay, I try to be fast. As Masoud mentioned, there is the different fintechs companies across the world that are collecting security measures of different IDs all across the world, and trying to build platforms to help foreigners in any country to rely to the government to rely on that solutions. But again, it's need to be understand that in the recommendation that I need to rely, the relying parties need to be trusted to rely on them on the identification of whatever the client who is trying to have the financial service. So it's the same approach, unfortunately, for everyone, that I need to rely on the fintechs. But on the risk-based approach, it's going to be different. If I can really start and give the whole product relying on this, or I need to do extended procedures from a CDD perspective.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think, Shanad, you wanted to intervene in some clarification on the Hawala?
Yeah, just a point. It was based on what Masood's comment about Hawala and trying to identify them. I mean, I think we've seen some different approaches in countries, but I think something that could be really useful is supervisors, regulators trying not just to identify these providers, but trying to bring them in some way into the formal regulated service, rather than just shutting them down, because it can just mean that they then and their customers, lead to other unregulated ways of moving money. So I don't know an easy way to do it, but trying to bring these players into the regulated sector, even if there is a process, it will take some time to build their capacity, etc. It might be a better way to manage the money laundering, terrorist financing risks. Just on reliance, very quickly, sorry. So reliance relates really to other financial institutions or regulated entities. Currently, we don't think of fintechs for the context of reliance, but that is something that we looked at a little bit in the digital ID guidance, that countries, maybe want to consider how the reliance rules apply to different fintech providers, and to what extent AML-CFT regulation really extends to fintech providers in relation to some of these solutions. But that's, again, another area, I think, for exploration.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for all the panelists today. Thank you for your time and your great expertise. I hope that the audience has benefited from all these experiences. And we want to wrap it up now, this session. I want to remind the audience that there is a survey that will come up. If you're still there, please complete it. And then we'll see you in the next session of the FIGI, which is in June 10th, on deep dive on policy approaches for digital payments and open banking. So thank you all. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Masood. Thank you, Mohammed. It has been a pleasure having you all here with us today.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks,
and
Thanks all.